So I think that we will start getting organized for our first presenter. Penelope Phillips Howard is with us in person, although she is usually based in Kenya. Penelope is at the Liver School of Tropical Medicine, and also, I'll let you introduce yourself. So please welcome Penelope.
Thank you, and I've been rather overly promoted. I'm not quite a professor, but thank you anyway for the generous acknowledgements. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, both in the room here and colleagues around the world. I'm not going to talk about Mongolia, unfortunately. Yeah, if you can put up the first presentation. Oh, okay. Okay. There's a scary moment there where it said Mongolia. Slide, please. That's great. Thank you very much. So shall I start? Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. So I'm presenting today on behalf of a very excellent collaborative team, the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai, UNICEF WASH in Schools in India, and the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine and partners. Next slide, please. So Professors Shivakami, Thakur, and Narendra are the leads in the Tata Institute. UNICEF, we have the pleasure of Mamita Bora Thakur actually in the audience, and she leads the team from UNICEF. And then the Liverpool School and partners, which includes the Centres for Disease Control, Atlanta, who are based in India. Next slide, please. So there have been some excellent presentations here over the last 3 years, and hopefully today also, regarding the plight of girls, schoolgirls, and their menstruation in India. So I'll just briefly summarize that they do indeed have problems. It affects the girls, their comfort, their hygiene, their safety, their dignity. They don't have access to hygienic cloths. They are restricted from religious restrictions, and they report being absent from school. So this large body of research we didn't want to waste, so we are including in our research project looking back at all the data in the form of a systematic review so that we can benefit from past research and then add to it through gaps in the literature. There are four government ministries involved and who have built up different services for girls in India over the last few years. And that includes awareness, building awareness, access to absorbents, and constructing toilets in schools, and developing disposal systems, including incinerators. So over the last few years, a massive amount of work has developed. So we thought, part of our systematic review, we would build on that body of information and see where the gaps are now still today. So the objectives of the research was to understand the barriers and the challenges of MHM and WASH in schools faced by the schoolgirls in India, and then use the data generated from the past studies, from our current field studies, and from the studies of the many collaborators in India. There's a huge amount of work being done. So the partners together will develop and deliver a holistic package for MHM, for schools to scale up across India. Next slide, please. So this is just very schematic, and it's really just to say that the project involves a desktop component, which is reviewing the national programme and data sources, and also the systematic review and meta-analysis, and then a field component, field studies in representative states, interviewing stakeholders, focus group discussions with beneficiaries, and schoolgirls surveys and teacher surveys, key informant interviews in schools and observations of WASH in schools, and building the information together with past studies and other collaborator studies to develop the holistic package. Next slide, please. So I won't belabor this. It's a typical timeline of any research in the field. And the 1 to 12 just shows the last year of activities. And fortunately for all of us, we are reaching the end of our field research, so we have been able to finish now collecting all of the data. We do have a few stakeholder interviews still to collect. Next slide, please. There are 68 million schoolgirls in India, so clearly we're not going to do that number of interviews. So in essence, what we needed to do was random sampling of a statistically significant sample size that allows us to analyse the data and reach conclusions. So 3 states had been purposefully chosen, and then this just shows the random sampling techniques that we used to identify our population. Next slide, please. So the data have been gathered, and on the right-hand side, the number of questionnaires, surveys, etc., that we were anticipating collecting is on the right. The total is actually larger than that, and in part this reflects that our original sample frame had taken girls we believed all to be menstruating, and then we find that in the schools, those particular age groups and classes had not all menstruated. So to ensure representation, we had to continue, and in fact we doubled our sample. Next slide, please. So a few minutes today just spent on some data that have been collected to date, and this is a typical example of how searches are conducted in the literature through word searches. And we did it in PubMed, Google Scholar, and Google Health. And then also literature, looking through the literature to see if we'd missed any references, and then through the grey literature. Next slide, please. So altogether, we, after we excluded, due to eligibility issues and lack of information within the articles, we concluded with 138 studies over the last 15 years. Next slide, please. So these studies are straddled across India, but you can see some gaps, and we're hoping with our field studies in those states to fill in some of those gaps also. Next slide, please. So let's move on to a little bit of data. The red shows the overall prevalence. The orange is always the urban responses, and green is the rural, and then slums are in light brown. And what you see is that fewer studies have been collected from slum areas in India. The numbers above the bars just signify the number of studies that have asked these questions. So this is about girls' menstrual awareness and knowledge, and we've taken 3 particular issues: awareness of menarche, the uterus, so physiology, do they understand anything about the physiology, and then that menstruation is a normal, healthy part of a girl's life. So you can see that nearly 50% of girls are aware of menarche, but a higher proportion in urban than rural areas, and even lower in slum areas. Much fewer girls understand about the uterus as a source of bleeding, and about just over 50% understand that menstruation is normal, again with the urban populations a higher proportion than rural areas and slums. Next slide, please. So the sources of information is just urban and rural here shown. What you see is the mother is predominantly the source of information, followed by friends, relatives, less so teachers, less so media, and very few studies have actually been conducted to understand what is going on with health workers and their provision of information for girls. So that's actually a clear gap in the information. Next slide, please. This is a meta-regression, so don't be too scared. The size of the circles reflect the size of the studies, so you can see there are small and large. Also, you see that the studies are very clustered in the last few years. So people around India are really, really taking hold of this. More and more studies are being conducted. Now, this is about religious restrictions during menstruation. You won't see it from the access because it's the log of the proportion. 77% overall, the pool prevalence, 77% of girls said that they had restrictions. 50% said they had restrictions in being able to move around the house and do things. About a third of them had restrictions with their diet or weren't allowed to sit with other people, and 25% were housebound. Now, the interesting thing about looking at studies over time, and this is rather disappointing when you think more and more education is going on in schools, is that nothing has changed. So there is absolutely no insignificant difference in the restrictions being placed on girls. And that was a little bit of a shocker for us. Next slide, please. So this one is looking at absorbents used by the schoolgirls. Commercial pads means any form of manufactured pads, local or brand names. Cloths in the middle, and then pads plus cloth, so that they vary during the day or during the week. And what you can see is about 45% of girls say they use some form of commercial pads, and very significantly different between the rural and the urban, with much higher proportionate use in the urban areas. And then the reverse of cloths, with a higher proportion in the slums and in the rural areas. We also did look at the studies of using underwear only. And there were only 8 studies of girls reporting on using underwear, and only 6% of girls reported that they used underwear only. But of course, you always have to take into account the shaming of asking these questions, and if girls accurately report that information. Next slide, please. Okay, this is another meta-regression, and this shows very distinctly, and it's highly significant over time, the proportion of girls that have access to commercial pads. And highly significant. So the pool prevalence is 45%, but before 2010 it was 28%, and after 2010 it was 78%. Now, when they say have access to pads, it may be just 1 or 2 for the early part of the period, or it might be access all the way through. So more study is needed for better understanding that. Next slide, please. Now, as the use of commercial pads increases, we have a real problem here, because what is happening with disposal? What you see here is that there is, across the board, many different systems that girls use, and they're very resourceful to dispose of their pads or their cloths. So overall, what you can see is routine waste disposal through a governmental system is much higher in urban than rural areas. Then girls also just throw away, they can burn, that includes incineration, or they bury in pits or bury around their gardens, and then also in the toilet. Next slide, please. Absence has become a big issue and it's quite controversial. Does menstrual hygiene, does problems with menstruation cause girls specifically to be absent? And I think the jury is very much out. More studies are needed and different methodologies are needed for gathering this information. So from these past studies, we see overall a quarter of girls say they are absent during their menstruation. And this differs in India very significantly. You can see these differences between areas of India, with very few reporting this in North India and West India, less so in South India, and nearly 50% in Central India. So we understand that these differ, and there's cultural reasons, maybe the amount of wash in schools going on in these different regions. Next slide, please. Now, we've tried to do something very fancy, and I think this is potentially quite controversial, and I think we need to be very cautious in interpretation. So this is using these past studies to look to see if there is a relationship between access to napkins or pads, commercial pads, and absence reported in those same studies. And we did see a linear relationship between that, and we were able to control for some confounders, but not all confounders. So other cofactors that could be involved. And what you see just in the basic meta-regression, you see a decline in absence with an increase in availability of pads. Okay? But when we adjusted for the region, it became not significant. So a lot of things are going on. It is just not a pad issue. And I think, the WASH group will be very, very happy to hear that. Right, the next slide, please. And the importance of WASH in school, I think we can't overemphasize that. This is just pooling studies together and looking at girls and asking them if they just change in schools. And just over a third of girls say they do. And that is, I think, phenomenal, that 2/3 of girls just don't like to change in school at all. Now, this follows on also, interestingly, from studies, and these are from around the world. It's only a very small number of studies to date that have shown direct association between absence and WASH in schools. So these are absence with very dirty toilets. One showed that if girls did have separate toilets, there was reduced absence. And then another study has shown that improving WASH in schools reduces girls' absence. So that previous slide, it really needs to be cautious and think about the other aspects relating to WASH in school, socioeconomic status, and other factors occurring. Next slide, please. So in summary, half the girls are unaware of menarche. There's still very much restrictions which are debilitating on their lives. The mothers are the main source of information. It appears rarely health workers. Only a third of girls change in schools, so there is the need for, obviously, the improvements in WASH in schools. The association, we need to be cautious for pads and absence, but it is an interesting finding. And we need to look at the other cofactors involved with that. There is a need for hygienic absorbance. We're very keen to stress we're not promoting menstrual pads specifically, because cloth, if it's hygienic, is very important to girls' lives and easily accessible. But awareness on how to keep the hygiene is important. Girls are not aware of any other options. They know nothing about insertables. Everyone talks about taboos, but I'd like to see the data on that. Disposal options are going to be a real problem in the future, so much work is needed on that. So the current programs are very promising. They're really building. There's huge commitment in India, but there's room for improvement. Fantastic water aids study looked at policy implications. and lack of convergence between the ministries at the moment. There are still plenty of gaps, so we hope our field data will contribute to understanding and filling in some of those gaps, and also all our collaborative partners in India to inform the holistic package. Last slide, please. Part of the theme of this conference is challenges and opportunities. So we're 3 different partners from 3 different parts of the world and different expertise, and we've all learned a huge amount from this collaboration. Knowledge and skill sets put in and expertise grown. But I think it's fair to say that there are differing understandings, commitments, and expectations. I think it's really important for all the different partners always to have these discussions, early on, to better empathize, with all the different partners of the groups, what everyone's needs are. We're always over-optimistic with our time frame. And, this happens the world over. So for us, it's, tackling all the different languages that we were confronting. Ethical approval should always be applied. Any human participants get ethical approval, but that takes time for the clearance process. And then school timetables. Invariably you get everything ready, and then it's a school holiday. True random selection, fantastic, highly representative. But the moment you do that, you end up in some, incredibly rural area with no logistic, no infrastructure. And you have to then think about the travel component, the safety of the women, and we've had to encounter, at one stage the women were traveling for 4 or 5 hours in a day just to do their field duties. And then lastly, I've already mentioned the age of menarche, maybe some pilot studies first to assess for those particular areas the sample size and the sampling frame, because we basically had to double our population. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't overstayed. Thank you.
Overstayed. We did learn that we can't actually see the chat box in here, although it's actively happening. So I'm going to go back there where I can see it and read the questions so that you can.
It easy.
The restrictions are really interesting, especially by religion, and clearly that's come out a lot in other studies that I've seen. Sure. And closer. Yeah. Okay. The restrictions that girls have, which certainly have an impact on whether or not they're in school or even leave school maybe once they're there. You've talked a lot about the 3 states you're working in.
Yes.
Are you able to look at any differences between Muslim girls and Hindu, and has that come up at all in your studies from the meta-analysis?
Yes. UNICEF assisted with the selection of these different states, and it's, excellent selection, because although I cannot answer to the data at the moment, it's still being cleaned, so it's pre-analysis. We have girls' religions, we have, different tribes, and we will be able to look at that. We ask a lot of questions about religion and restrictions in their lives. Yeah, I think and age, does it change over time, and family? It'll be amazingly interesting. Thank you.
So Penny, a couple questions from online. One was, where was the research conducted? Primary, secondary, or both? I think the online people.
Okay, so the primary research is conducted in Chhattisgarh, Tamil Nadu, and Maharashtra. The secondary data analysis from the desktop review, systematic review, as shown by the picture of India, is wherever those studies took place. So across India. So if there are gaps, the gaps are there because no studies took place.
I think but they may also have meant schooling, so the schooling level.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, so upper primary and lower secondary. So it's as girls reach menarche and early experiences.
Okay. How many... Someone asked, you haven't discussed any quality appraisal of the included studies. Was this something that was taken into account? My exposure to the current literature on MHM is that of highly variable quality.
Yes. Yes, studies also always vary in quality, and these go back a number of years, and I think studies are becoming more and more rigorous over time. We did do a very rigorous quality assessment, and 20% of the studies were not particularly good quality, and about 25% were very high quality. But we did not exclude the quality of the studies because we feel we would have lost too much data. So, and we looked at things like, did they do sample size calculations, a lot of epidemiological quality assessments. Thank you.
Okay, great. There was another question. Any taboo found in the burning of napkins?
Oh, yes. But that I'm learning from my colleagues as opposed to the actual data has not been analysed to date. But certainly, yeah, in the systematic review, it's pockets, it's particular tribes, particular areas where it's absolute taboo. So, the idea to have incinerators in every school in the country, I think, is going to run into some cultural problems.
And then a final question, then we'll take one for the room. What are the difficulties with introducing a teaching person for the girls? I don't know if that came up.
I think I might have to pass on that one. I'm not really sure how to answer it. Sorry, maybe next year. We're hoping some more of our Indian colleagues next year will be here and can present the studies and can answer that question.
Okay, we have a lot more on the chat box, but let's take one from in person. And
Yeah.
maybe just identify yourself.
Okay, I'm Libet Lochner. I work with the water program at the World Bank, and I used to work with UNICEF. My question is about it being a taboo, because it must be one of the most public taboos in the world if 70% of girls who face some restriction when they're menstruating, but then it's also a taboo, because if you face a restriction, then everybody knows you're menstruating, I guess.
It is very complicated, actually. I mean, I don't know if Mamita, you want to answer this question, or you'd like to come, or am I making it embarrassing for you? So with taboos, there's an upside and a downside, because in talking with our colleagues that really understand India, much better than me, some of the girls like the fact that they're restricted, because they don't have to do all the chores, they don't have to do the cleaning, they can have a rest. So I think the origins of the taboo in many years ago were actually very sensible. It's just that it is imposing certain restrictions on girls' lives now. So I think it's not it's not a kind of every taboo is bad and should be lifted. And indeed, it potentially does display girls and put them in an uncomfortable position. So I think it's an area where greater research can be done. And formative research, I think, like participatory rural appraisal, or some different techniques can be used. It's not just a yes or no answer.
Okay, unfortunately, I think we have to move on, but Penny is here, and there will probably be other opportunities during the moderated discussion to ask a couple more questions.